That was great. Yeah, one of my favorite stories is something of the sort where like a professor like wrote in his paper like he was using information traveling through radio waves, and he was like, I'm not really quite sure what the application is, but whenever someone gets here, it's here. And then 40 years later, now we're communicating everything over the phone, like you were saying. So it's just really sometimes you just do it for the love of the science, knowing that if it's important enough, somebody will find use. But another really key important thing that you brought up a lot during your explanation was you have been working with governments such as like the UN and Spain, the government of Spain, and that's like a completely different thing that we've never touched on the podcast, which is the interaction between engineers or innovators and policymakers. So can you explain to us what is the importance of this relationship and how have you utilized it with PuzzleX or AMPT to further expand your resources or even your communication to the broader audience of the general public?
Good question. Policymakers are human beings, scientists are human beings, right? The problem is that we don't speak the same language. That's the same thing that if somebody wrote your papers or something that we've produced in science and they look and say, oh, that looks gibberish. The same thing is applied when we look at the way the policy works, the work that the Senate, I don't know, appropriation, any of these things, even these words don't mean anything to us. When I was running the National Graphene Association, that was the first time that I actually had to interface with that because we had to do policy work, advocacy work on Capitol Hill. So I remember sitting down and thinking, oh, those things like about Senate and House. Now let me look at that, like if I would understand that better because now I actually need it. And it was a re-education. And we're not taught that. I mean, even maybe you take a course, but that's a useless course. I did take that course. I don't remember a single thing that I learned in that thing. You only learn things where you actually have to use them and you go back and say, oh, now that makes sense. So we are not given the language to speak to policymakers, which is okay. It doesn't mean that you have to speak everybody's language. But if there are people who are interested in that element of policy, I have one advice for them, a few. One is, when I was doing my PhD, I really thought to myself, I am never, ever going to be one of those people who go on Capitol Hill and rub shoulders. Who are these people? These sellouts. I mean, what are they doing? That doesn't even make sense to me. Seriously, that attitude needs to stop. So then I was like, a few years later, I was the one who was doing those things. I said the same thing about standardization as well. And I was like, oh, are these people who sit around? They don't have a life. They sit around and they talk about what to call what? Don't you have a life? I am actually a US expert on the majority of the graphene documents right now. A lot of these things we don't know. So it's an unknown world. And you say, not for me, I don't understand it. So I would say, if you're thinking like that, take a minute to say, there was somebody else who thought like that, and they are now doing that. And it is useful. If it wasn't useful, I wouldn't be doing that. Why is it useful? Even though we don't have the same common language, it's because the patient capital that is needed for a lot of the fundamental science work and a lot of the experimental or a lot of the application work comes from the government. If government decides to fund, I don't know, what material are you guys working on?
David, you go first.
I'm working on battery systems, so like NMC and other battery systems.
Okay, battery systems for the system, the one that you're talking about, MSC?
NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Okay. What about you?
Working on piezoelectric materials within ultrasound catheters for medical devices.
Okay, so let's think about that. If there was no funding for piezoelectric materials, your research would not have been done. You wouldn't be sitting here talking about this right now, right? Who puts that money in there, in those appropriation that goes into cost for proposals, and then you're probably your advisor or your PI applies for it, and then you get funding, and then you can hire graduate students, and then you can do this. It's the government. So the policy and advocacy work that you do from the other side, from the science side, is a lot of that is going to be on what are the areas where we really need to put emphasis on, which is going to bear fruit in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years. And that element, instead of us relying on lobbyists, on Capitol Hill that know nothing about our materials. We need to be the ones who actually go there because we understand what's the value of it. And again, throughout all of this, for the sake of impact, be objective and do not just don't put a blindfold on and say ours is the best. Be understanding that this is government money, this is taxpayers' dollars that goes into this. So if you really believe that there's going to be some impact done in your field, then go and advocate for it. That's the reason why I put a lot of emphasis in it, because there needed to be funding directed to graphene activities in the US. And we were successful in doing that, appropriating money for certain applications, for infrastructure, for other applications, for electronics, et cetera, so that people would be able to do more research, people would be able to actually do more entrepreneurial, bridging the gap activities. But to do that, we need scientists to know the language of policymakers. And sometimes there are I think AAAS does have these fellowships, these policy fellowships. I never did that. I wish I had. Do you know how much I would have learned if I had that? That would have been much. If I actually had any learnings, I had to learn on my own these things, and it takes much longer. But if you're interested in that, there are these fellowships that you can actually, if you really want to do it, there are these fellowships that you can do. On the other side of it, if you do not want to leave your postdoc and you just say, I want to learn more about it. There are a lot of resources out there. Just search, just start learning. Like, as scientists, we like learning. Like, just go around and find out what is being done, find out the lingo, the terminology, the nomenclature, all of those things that is done. And at a certain point, you start feeling more comfortable with it. And then at that point, there is always going to be some element of that in every university. Find out who is doing what in your university. Go to them and say, I'm interested in something like this. Is there anything I can do? Or look for some of the associations, MRS, for example, APS, all of those associations, scientific associations, have a policy arm, which usually is not known to students, right? I mean, why would you? They're not focused on us. They're focused on more kind of applications for the members or for senior members. Go there and say, what can I do? I want to do something.
Thank you for watching this segment of the It's a Material World podcast. For the full episode, hit the link in the description. We'll see you soon, and in the meantime, go change the world.